It's a pleasure to introduce Ezekiel Emanuel, oncologist, political philosopher, and bioethicist, as the 2020 recipient of the ASBH Lifetime Achievement Award. In my estimation, no one, including all those who have won the award previously, deserves this honor more than Zeke does. His overall contributions to bioethics and medical humanities has been enormous. In this introduction, I'll speak briefly to his contributions in the way of scholarship, organizational leadership, public service, and activities as a public intellectual. But before I do, let me acknowledge that I know Zeke much less well than a lot of people involved with ASBH. When I was a visiting scholar in the NIH Department of Bioethics in 0607, Zeke was head of the department. So that's when we had the most opportunities to interact. Fortunately, it doesn't take a long-term colleague or close friend to appreciate his contributions. He is an extraordinary scholar. He has authored or edited at least a dozen books and has authored over 200 journal articles. There's so much outstanding material that it's hard to summarize. Several of his books are cutting-edge investigations into human research ethics, and several others address the American healthcare system. One I've used in class, Healthcare Guaranteed, could not be better informed about the topic, which is how to reform the American system. Yet it's delightful to read, which is quite an achievement. I won't attempt to summarize the many journal articles, except to mention 3 points. First, unlike a lot of prolific scholars, Zeke tends to publish in absolutely top journals. He has myriad articles in the most elite medical journals, yet is also published in elite non-medical journals, such as Ethics. Moreover, an almost ridiculous number of his journal articles, according to Google Scholar, have been cited at least 500 times, and a handful have been cited over 1,000 times. On top of this formidable, high-impact scholarly contribution is Zeke's outsized organizational contribution to American bioethics. The one closer to my heart, since I'm now employed part-time at NIH, is his building of the Department of Bioethics, which he led for many years before Christine Grady, last year's winner of the Lifetime Achievement Award, took over the reins. Zeke was extremely perceptive in designing the space of the department, which is organized so as to encourage frequent interactions among scholars and fellows. And he chose exceptionally well in hiring staff. The institution of afternoon tea, which impresses many visitors, is a time-honored touch. The first and second year fellow seminars, journal club, and many other aspects of institutional life in the Department of Bioethics help to make it the highest functioning and most collegial department I've ever known. Currently, Zeke is Vice Provost for Global Initiatives, fitting the topic of his recent book on global justice and bioethics, and he chairs the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at UPenn. I'm not really in a position to comment on how he has shaped the institutional culture there, but knowing him, I assume his impact has been very extensive and positive. In addition to being a formidable scholar and institutional leader, Zeke has made his mark as a public servant, building bridges between academic work and policy formation. In '93, he served as a member of President Clinton's Task Force on Healthcare, although, as we all know, that reform effort went nowhere. Other stints of service include a 3-year term with NBAC, the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, which generated important reports, including a great one on cloning. His signature public service contribution, though, was working as special advisor for health policy in the Obama administration as it forged what became the Affordable Care Act. Now, some who know Zeke's name have neither worked in one of his departments, served alongside him in some public capacity, nor even read any of his scholarly writings. Rather, they know him as an author of op-eds in the New York Times, a commentator on CNN, an author of a very controversial piece in The Atlantic, or a public intellectual who appears in any number of other fora. I can't think of another American bioethicist or medical humanities scholar who is more prominent and more respected today as a public intellectual. So I trust that you who are listening will share my conviction that Zeke Emanuel is overwhelmingly deserving of the honor of ASBH's Lifetime Achievement Award of 2020. Thank you, ASBH, for giving him this award. And Zeke, congratulations.
I'm hugely honored by this award, but it also makes me feel very, very old. And I'm not near 75, really. It's more than a decade away. This makes me feel like some of those professors in tweed and elbow patches sitting in their easy chair after they're retired, pontificating away. But as those of you who know me, I rarely sit in chairs and I try not to pontificate. I prefer an exchange. But I do thank you for seeing that I should get this award. And so in my few brief moments, I want to really make just three quick points. Point number one, COVID represents an inflection point for the whole field of bioethics. Bioethics is now fully inside the tent, and it's inside the tent right from the start. It's not coming in ex post facto after some scandal has arisen. Let me just give you a few of examples from my experience within the last few weeks. At the WHO in February, there was a meeting of over 300 scientists, researchers, and others on how to address COVID. There were 10 working groups which were established. There's one on vaccine, obviously, one on therapeutics, one on epidemiology. But right there at the very first meeting, among the 10 core working groups was the working group on ethics and COVID. In addition, there was a working group on social sciences and COVID. So we were right in the tent right from the start. Similarly, the WHO has the SAGE, the Senior Advisory Group of Experts to the Director General that meets. They have ethicists right on that group. They have subcommittees that deal with bioethics. CDC and NIH contracted with the National Academy before a vaccine was available, before any vaccine has been proven safe and effective, to give them advice about how to ethically allocate a vaccine in the United States that we know is going to be in short supply. They didn't wait for a scandal. They wanted advice. It was recognized that this was an ethical issue, and they needed an ethical point of view to advise them. And if we just look at the major biomedical journals, whether the New England Journal or JAMA or Lancet, we can see pages and pages filled with bioethical advice right at the start, looking at the allocation of ventilators, looking at immunity passports, looking at disparities of care. This is not an afterthought, but a pre-thought. It's right built in. Now, I said that this was an inflection point, not a culmination. Culmination somehow implies that we've arrived, we're at the top. I don't think that's true. There are still many barriers, but we're in the tent. We are part of the core group. There's a reflex now, part of the checklist to say that bioethics needs to be considered. We are included. And again, I don't think this is a culmination. We can't rest on our laurels, but we do have to recognize we're inside. It's taken a long time. There are obviously, that's my second point, taken a long time. There are many, many different ways of doing the history of bioethics. I'm talking about bioethics as a field, not particular bioethical advice that has been integral, has to be integral, really since the start of medicine as a career activity, core activity. One way of marking the start is to look at the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with all the research ethical scandals, Beecher and Tuskegee, culminating in 45 CFR 46, as well as a national commission and a presidential commission. That version of history, it's as has been said by many people, bioethics was born in scandal. That kind of bioethics is a response. It's come in and help us clean up the mess after the mess has happened. It's not bioethics as part of the tent, recognizing that doing research has bioethical implications. They need to be delineated beforehand. It's clean up the mess ex post facto. Another way of doing the history is thinking about the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, all the controversy around end-of-life care that was so important to establishing bioethics presence in hospitals. But again, this attention was not ethics at the core, ethics as part of the pre-thought. This was ethics on the back of legal cases about terminating life-sustaining treatment. Ethics was brought in after the law laid down parameters, searching for constitutional justifications for various approaches. I think in this case also, ethics was initially secondary. Now, mainly because of COVID, but after a very long buildup, ethics is being brought in not after a scandal, not on the back of some other legal consideration, not to justify those legal decisions, but it's seen as integral to a comprehensive approach to a biomedical problem. It's seen by the key actors, whether scientists, researchers, heads of major national organizations, that they cannot ignore ethics, that it actually has to be explicitly part of the discussion right from the start. That is a huge change, and a huge change that has occurred in my lifetime. And it is very different. And it brings us to my third point, which is now that we're in the tent, there are differences for the field of bioethics. Once you're part of the club, the behavior and the attitude has to change. Let me hazard three important implications. Implication number one is now that we're part of the tent, we actually have to offer solutions. We can't spend our time dissecting problems and making them complex. You can dissect the problem, but only to give solutions. We have to orient ourselves to taking substantive stances that are well justified and can be connected with policy. And I think this is very, very important. I still hear lots of complaints, some of them valid, many of them not valid. You know, we bring in the bioethicists and they tell us what the problems are. I think the field has to establish and promote actually substantive solutions to problems. We clearly have done that in many, many areas. We've got substance when it comes to research ethics. We've got substance when it comes to end-of-life care. But I think this is a primary focus. Second, I think the COVID moment highlights the prominence of allocation issues. For those of us who grew up reading the various editions of Beecham and Childress and the Four Principles, we may have been, as I have been and I've written about, frustrated by the justice principle that was so short in the book and not very well developed. Many reasons for that. It doesn't lend itself to same kind of overlapping consensus that autonomy or beneficence or non-malfeasance does. And it's much harder to do in a straightforward way. Well, as we're seeing with COVID, we can't actually minimize the distributive justice side of the world. It is central. We can't have a weak justice section in our text. I think both domestically and internationally, the allocation issue is prominent and only going to become ever more prominent. And that requires hard work on our part as bioethicists if we're going to give substantive advice. It requires hard work of really deeply understanding distributive justice, how distributive justice is married with sophistication to economics, public policy, international relations. The world needs, and as they've shown with COVID, wants our advice, and we need to be prepared to give it. And the third thing is related to that issue of distributive justice. One of the things that distributive justice requires is marrying ethics with empirics. Data, the way the world will strongly influence how ethical principles are implemented. We just can't issue the ethical principles. We have to delineate how they will be implemented and their consequences for actual real life policy. Thus, I think we're going to have to marry and understand how the data influences our ethical principles, modifies them in the real world. So I just want to conclude by thanking ASBH for this tremendous honor, making me lose a few more hairs and grow older faster. But I also do think that this moment in our history is a very propitious and auspicious moment. It is a moment of inflection where bioethics as a field is clearly part of the core of biomedicine, not seen as secondary, not seen as an afterthought, but is seen as something that is integral to biomedicine. We need to take that and rise to the challenge and show that bioethics can answer the various demands and questions put to it. Thank you very much.